Have you ever looked at someone and thought they have it all together? The big house, the luxury car, the dazzling smile in every photo, thousands of likes, a calendar booked months in advance, people clapping when they speak, admiring their every move. But behind that smile, what if there's a silence no one hears? A pause, a question, a whisper that grows louder the closer they get to having it all. Is this it? That simple question, the one most never say out loud, is the same question that shakes even the most accomplished souls at 2 a.m. It doesn't show up on Instagram. You won't find it in TED Talks or Forbes interviews, but it's there, in the background of every perfectly filtered success story. It's the hidden truth that lingers behind a CEO's grin. It's tucked beneath the applause after the Nobel Prize speech. It haunts the artist whose masterpiece is finally hanging in a museum. If I've made it, why do I still feel so unfinished? In this series, we're not just going to talk about success, not the kind that comes with followers or fancy titles. We're going to ask the uncomfortable questions, the ones most people spend their lives avoiding. We'll explore the smiles that hide sorrow, the victories that feel hollow, and the quiet inner wars that no amount of money or fame can silence. But we're also going to discover something much deeper, because beneath that question, is this it? Lies a doorway, not to more achievements but to something more real, more lasting, more alive. Through stories drawn from life, Buddhist wisdom, and raw human truth, we'll uncover the quiet power of stillness, simplicity, and self-understanding. You don't need to renounce your job, shave your head, or sit in a cave to find it. You just need to start noticing the noise we mistake for purpose, noticing the addiction to more that masks a fear of being less, noticing the hunger behind every success story that still isn't full. And once you start noticing, you can start awakening. This is not a path of escape. It's not about rejecting the world. It's about finally understanding your place in it, not as a performer, not as a chaser of dreams, but as a witness to the truth already inside you. In the coming chapters, we'll walk this path together. You'll hear stories that feel eerily familiar. You'll meet people who had everything and still felt nothing. And you'll begin to see how the world's loudest victories often echo the deepest inner losses. But more importantly, you'll begin to remember who you are when all the noise fades. When the striving stops, when the smile softens, when the mask falls away, that's where the real journey begins. And now, without needing permission from the world, without needing to fix, prove, or chase, we begin that journey quietly, truthfully together. Let's take the first step. They tell you happiness is just a click away, that the glow of your phone screen, the thrill of a package at your doorstep, or the right filter on your photo will somehow fill the hollow ache inside. We live in a world where joy is packaged, priced, and promoted. But here's the quiet truth no one wants to say aloud. What we're chasing isn't real happiness. It's distraction dressed up in luxury. Think about it. We scroll endlessly, laugh at 10-second videos, and double-tap curated lives. But once the screen goes dark, what's left? Silence, emptiness, that nagging sense that something is missing, but we can't name it. Modern happiness is a marketplace. It whispers, "You're not enough, but if you buy this, maybe you will be." A better phone, a newer car, a trendier lifestyle. These are the badges of so-called success. And yet, even as our possessions grow, our peace shrinks. We are more connected than ever and more alone. We smile in selfies but cry in silence. We go to parties but feel invisible. We laugh at jokes but ache on the inside. It's a paradox we've accepted as normal, but it's not. It's not normal to feel empty when you're surrounded by everything. Somewhere along the way, we replaced meaning with momentary pleasure. We substituted deep connection for dopamine hits. We traded inner peace for outside validation. And what's worse, we believe the illusion is real. We believe if we just try harder, achieve more, be more like them, we'll finally be happy. But comparison is a thief, and consumption is a bottomless pit. No matter how much you pour into it, it's never full. So how do you wake up from this illusion? You begin by asking a question no ad campaign wants you to ask. What does happiness feel like when no one's watching? Not what it looks like, what it feels like. Does it feel like stillness? Like the comfort of being with yourself without judgment? Like watching the sunset and not needing to take a photo? Real happiness doesn't scream for attention. It hums quietly in your chest. It's the smile you give when no one's around. The sigh of relief when you're honest with yourself. The moment you realize you're not missing out, you're actually coming home to yourself. Buddhist wisdom teaches that happiness isn't something we acquire. It's something we uncover. It's already there, beneath the noise, the fear, the pretending. It's in being, not having. It's in awareness, not accumulation. Modern happiness says, run faster. Buddhist wisdom says, sit still. Modern happiness says, you need more. Buddhist wisdom says, you already are. Modern happiness is loud. True happiness is silent. And once you begin to see through the illusion, you realize the things that used to excite you. The constant scrolling, the rush of likes, the new purchase. They lose their power because they were never yours to begin with. They were borrowed feelings, temporary highs, and now you're searching for something deeper. So what's the next step once you stop believing the illusion? You start listening, not to the world outside, but to the voice within, the one that's been whispering all along. There is more to life than this. And that whisper leads us right to the next truth, waiting to be unraveled. So you finally got it. The thing you've been dreaming of. The promotion, the car, the trip, the perfect relationship. For a brief moment, life feels like a movie. Sunlight hits just right, your chest is light, and the world seems to applaud your victory. But then days pass, the applause fades, and before you know it, you're right back where you started, restless, distracted, maybe even empty. This isn't failure, this is psychology. There's a term for this silent phenomenon that robs you of long-term happiness: hedonic adaptation. It's the brain's tendency to quickly return to a baseline level of happiness, regardless of major positive or negative events. Imagine buying your dream home. For a few weeks, you walk around in awe, every corner makes you smile. But 6 months in, you barely notice the details. The novelty becomes the norm. It's like your emotional thermostat resets. Why does this happen? Because the human mind is astonishingly adaptable. And while this trait helps us survive after painful losses, it also makes us immune to sustained pleasure. That brand new car smell, gone. That exciting new love, now part of your daily routine. Even the excitement of newfound freedom wears thin with time. Here's the real twist. The more often you chase pleasure, the faster your mind adapts to it. It's like trying to quench your thirst by drinking seawater. At first, it feels like a solution, but in the end, you only want more. Buddhism saw this thousands of years before psychology gave it a name. The Buddha taught that clinging to fleeting pleasures creates dukkha, a deep, unsatisfied craving. Because every time we reach for something to make us happy, we plant the seed for eventual disappointment. A modern life wired around upgrades and instant gratification only makes it worse. Apps that promise dopamine in 3 seconds. Fast fashion, fast food, fast love. Each one offering a quick hit of joy, then vanishing into the void of familiarity. So what's the way out? You can't stop your brain from adapting, but you can stop trying to outrun it. Here, what the wise do differently. They practice awareness over attachment. Instead of chasing a new feeling, they learn to rest in stillness. They anchor their joy not in outcomes but in presence, not in what changes but in what remains. Gratitude is one key, but not the shallow kind. Real gratitude means noticing the miracle in the mundane, the warmth of your tea, the laughter of a child, the softness of morning light. When you stop taking these for granted, they stop adapting out of your consciousness. Meditation, too, is a quiet rebellion against hedonic adaptation. It trains the mind to be content with what is, not what could be. You begin to see that joy isn't something to find, it's something you uncover. And finally, serving others cuts through the hedonic loop, because meaning doesn't fade like pleasure does. The memory of giving stays with you longer than the thrill of receiving. It carves depth into your happiness, something no dopamine spike can replace. So the next time joy fades faster than you expected, don't panic. You're not broken, you're just human. But perhaps it's time to stop running on the hedonic treadmill and start walking the inner path. Now, having seen how fleeting joy becomes when based on pleasure, let's take a deeper look at what we often mistake for peace. She had the penthouse, the world's applause, the bank account that could buy anything except peace, except joy. He had 5 cars, 2 homes, and a calendar booked out for the next 6 months, not for rest, but for responsibilities. They were everything the world called successful. But if you looked close, really close, you'd see something missing. A hollow behind the eyes, a tiredness that no sleep could fix. A question buried beneath the designer suits and Instagram-perfect smiles. Is this really it? You see, we've been sold a one-size-fits-all formula: climb the ladder, hit the goals, get the titles, stack the cash, win the crowd. And then you'll feel fulfilled. But life isn't a vending machine. Success isn't a currency that automatically buys meaning. And deep down, we all know it. Because here's the truth: success is external, fulfillment is internal. And the two are not always aligned. Success is applause, loud, fleeting, addictive. Fulfillment is silence, deep, grounded, unshakable. Success is being seen by many. Fulfillment is being known by yourself. And yet, modern culture confuses them so easily. It tells us that if you're not constantly achieving, upgrading, outperforming, you're falling behind. So we keep sprinting on a treadmill, chasing mile markers that move faster the closer we get. We hustle not from inspiration but from fear. Fear of being average, fear of disappointing others, fear that without all the accomplishments we are not enough. But what if we flipped the script? What if, instead of asking, "How can I become more successful?" we asked, "What actually makes me feel alive?" What conversations leave you nourished? What moments leave you still, not needing anything more? Maybe it's not the raise, but the quiet dinner with someone who sees your soul. Maybe it's not the $1,000,000 deal, but the time you gave your full heart to help a friend without expecting anything back. Maybe it's not being admired, but being understood. Fulfillment is often found in what doesn't look glamorous. It's found in stillness, in service, in slowing down long enough to ask, am I living in alignment with who I truly am? Because at the end of your life, it won't be your LinkedIn profile or the number of followers that matter. It will be the love you gave, the lives you touched, the peace you carried. And here's the most radical truth of all. You don't have to sacrifice success to find fulfillment, but you do have to redefine it. You have to stop measuring your worth by metrics the soul doesn't care about. No award will ever satisfy the yearning for inner stillness. No applause will ever replace the quiet contentment of a well-lived, value-aligned life. Success is a tool. Fulfillment is the compass. Let success serve your soul, not silence it. Because when success and fulfillment merge, that's when life stops feeling like a performance and starts feeling like truth. And maybe, just maybe, we've been aiming at the wrong target all along. There's a deeper reason why joy slips through our fingers the moment we grasp it. It's not because we're ungrateful or broken. It's something built into our minds, a psychological trap that even the happiest people fall into. Let's pull back the curtain on one of the biggest invisible forces shaping your emotions. We call it hedonic adaptation. We chase, we strive, we hunger, but for what? Every day we wake up with an invisible thread pulling at our hearts, a longing, a need, a silent whisper that says more. More success, more admiration, more love, more things, and this is craving. Craving, or T, a letter 1E47HA macron as the Buddha called it, is not just wanting. It is wanting with teeth. It bites into us with desire and doesn't let go. It makes us believe that something out there, just one step beyond what we have, will finally complete us. It's subtle, seductive, and deadly. You see, most people think the root of their suffering is failure. But that's not true. It's not failure that torments us, it's the relentless desire for more, even when we already have enough. Let's pause. Think about a moment you achieved something you deeply wanted. A job, a relationship, a recognition. How long did the joy last? A day, a week, a month at most, and then craving crept in again, whispering, "What's next?" That's the cycle, and it never ends unless you see it for what it is. Craving turns our lives into a treadmill. We run faster, sweat harder, and yet remain in the same place mentally, emotionally, spiritually. This is not just a Buddhist idea. Modern psychology backs this up. Craving activates the brain's reward center, flooding us with dopamine, but only temporarily. Once that hit wears off, we're left emptier than before. Why? Because we didn't solve the inner hunger. We only fed the outer impulse. And craving is not always loud. Sometimes it disguises itself as ambition, sometimes as love, sometimes as self-improvement. It doesn't shout, it whispers. But its message is always the same. You are not enough. You do not have enough. Keep going. But here's the Buddhist twist: craving isn't evil. It's simply misunderstood. It arises from ignorance, avijja, our lack of understanding of the nature of reality. We crave because we believe that the object of our desire will give us lasting happiness. But reality says otherwise. No object, no person, no status can give us permanent peace, because they're all impermanent. Let's take a moment to breathe this in. Everything we chase, success, wealth, love, youth, will eventually fade. That's not a curse. That's a reminder, a call to look deeper, to go inward, to awaken. Buddhism doesn't tell us to stop living. It tells us to stop clinging, to enjoy without attachment, to love without control, to achieve without obsession. It invites us to recognize that the joy we seek is not after the craving, it's beyond it. When you stop craving, even a simple cup of tea becomes blissful. When you stop grasping, even silence feels like music. And when you let go of the need for things to be different, the world begins to feel enough. This is the middle path, not indulgence, not denial, but awareness. Craving may rise. Let it. Just don't follow it. Because the moment you see craving for what it is, an illusion of fulfillment, you begin to step into something far more powerful. Contentment. And contentment is freedom. Now that we've uncovered the root of restlessness, let's walk deeper. Because beneath craving lies something even more hidden, more dangerous, and more subtle. It's what keeps us from experiencing peace, even when life is good. It's time to face the inner noise. Let's go. They told us to run from pain, to avoid it, escape it, drown it in distractions, numb it with pleasures, silence it with noise. From childhood, we were taught that suffering is something to flee from, that pain is an intruder, something that doesn't belong in a happy life. But what if everything we've been taught is upside down? What if the real key to peace is not in running from suffering but in turning toward it. In the quiet stillness of Buddhist teachings, a profound truth emerges. Suffering is not your enemy. Suffering is your teacher, your compass, your mirror. And unless you have the courage to face it, to really see it, you'll never uncover the peace that lives beneath it. Let's go deeper. When the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, he wasn't looking for pleasure, comfort, or success. He sat in complete silence, confronting every form of suffering the human mind can conjure: fear, desire, regret, restlessness, loneliness, even the fear of death itself. And instead of resisting these experiences, he opened his mind fully to them. He didn't fight the storm. He became still within it. This turning towards suffering is where real transformation begins. In today's world, when you're anxious, you scroll. When you're lonely, you swipe. When you're overwhelmed, you binge-watch, overeat, overwork, anything but sit still. The modern mind has been conditioned to react, avoid, fix. But Buddhism invites something radically different. What if you just sat with it? The ache of loss, the sting of disappointment, the heaviness of regret. What if you stopped pushing it away and instead asked, "What are you here to teach me?" In Buddhist psychology, suffering is not a punishment, it's a signal. Like a fire alarm in a quiet room, it wakes you up to the truth. It's life's way of whispering, "There's something important here. Look closer." And when you do, something magical begins to happen. Instead of spiraling deeper into anxiety, you begin to understand your anxiety. Instead of letting sadness crush you, you learn to hold it gently, like a parent holding a crying child. Instead of fearing change, you learn to flow with it. Turning towards suffering doesn't make the pain disappear instantly. It's not a quick fix, but it does remove the added layer of struggle, the resistance, the denial, the blame. And when resistance melts, clarity begins. Let me tell you a story from the Zen tradition. There once was a young monk who came to his master in tears. "Master," he said, "my heart is broken. I've lost someone I love. I can't bear the pain. What do I do?" The master looked at him and replied, "Feel it completely." "But it's too much," the monk said, trembling. The master poured him a cup of tea, then poured more and more until it overflowed onto the floor. "Master, it's spilling," the monk shouted. "Yes," the master said, "and so is your heart. But when you allow the overflow without judgment or fear, it eventually becomes still. You must taste your suffering like bitter tea. Only then will its lesson reveal itself." This is the heart of it. Pain is a bitter tea, but it contains medicine. If you avoid it, you stay sick. If you drink it, you heal. Modern culture tells you that happiness is the absence of suffering. But Buddhism whispers a different truth. Happiness is the embrace of life in all its forms, even the difficult ones. Grief and love walk hand in hand. Fear and courage dance together. Suffering and growth are inseparable. And when you stop trying to separate them, something extraordinary unfolds. You become whole. This wholeness doesn't come from fixing everything. It comes from accepting everything. You stop pretending life is only about sunny days and you learn to appreciate the rain, the storms, the droughts. You no longer see suffering as a problem but as a pathway. This is what it means to walk the middle way, not escaping into pleasure, not collapsing into despair, but standing present with whatever arises, neither clinging nor pushing away. And in that balance, in that presence, true peace is born. Not the fleeting peace that depends on conditions, but the deep, unwavering peace that exists even when things fall apart. That's the peace of the awakened mind. And it begins the moment you stop running and start listening. So how do you do it? Not by force, not by pressure. You start by breathing, you sit, you notice. You feel the tightness in your chest, the heat in your face, the ache in your heart. And you say, "Yes, this too belongs." You let the moment be as it is. And in that acceptance, suffering begins to soften, not because it's gone, but because it's been seen. You see, suffering doesn't demand that you fix it, it just wants to be held. Like a child crying in the night. And when you hold it, something inside you awakens. A deeper wisdom, a compassion, a strength that isn't built in the gym but forged in the fire of your own tenderness. That is where the journey turns. That is where the real path begins. Now that we've stopped running, now that we've faced the truth of suffering, what comes next? What do we do with the pain we've welcomed in? We begin to understand its root. Let's go even deeper, into the craving that gives rise to it all. So far, we've peeled back the layers of modern life: success, craving, the illusion of happiness. And what lies underneath isn't comfort, it's suffering. And yet, there's something oddly liberating in that realization. Because once you stop running from it, you finally stop running at all. The chase ends. But if the chase ends, then what begins? That's where the Buddha's path unfolds before us, not as an abstract idea or spiritual theory, but as a living, breathing guide to freedom. A real path, one you can walk today, with your feet, your choices, your breath. It's called the Noble Eightfold Path. And unlike the flashy self-help formulas we scroll past daily, this path isn't a shortcut to pleasure or productivity. It's a slow and steady return to yourself. The first step, right view. Not right as in morally superior or rigidly correct, but right in the sense of alignment, of clarity. It means seeing reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Not as our fears distort it, just as it is. And what is that reality? That life is impermanent. That clinging brings suffering. That letting go is possible. When you begin to see this clearly, you stop blaming others for your pain. You stop thinking, if I just had that one thing, more money, more love, more time, then I'd finally be okay. Because now you know the problem isn't out there. It never was. Next comes right intention. Here, S where the path shifts inward. It asks, what are you really aiming for? Are you acting from greed, anger, delusion? Or from renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness? Most of us don't even realize how many of our actions stem from subtle grasping, like the way we speak kindly just to be liked, or work hard just to feel worthy. But right intention is about inner honesty. It's the courage to say, I will live from compassion, not ego. I will move from stillness, not fear. Then there's right speech. You start noticing your words. Not just what you say, but why. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? And suddenly the way you speak becomes sacred, not to impress, not to dominate, but to connect, to heal, to serve. Right speech isn't silence, it's mindful sound. From here we enter right action. This isn't about being perfect, it's about integrity. You stop harming. You stop taking what isn't given. You stop using others for pleasure or power. And slowly your life becomes a mirror of your heart. Gentle, honest, clean. And what supports this? Right livelihood. This means earning in ways that don't betray your soul. No more jobs that drain you or destroy others just to survive. You start to care how your money is made because it carries energy. And you want that energy to nourish, not corrupt. Then comes the engine of the path, right effort. Not hustle, not burnout, but wise effort. It's the kind that notices unwholesome thoughts and lets them go. It waters seeds of kindness, patience, joy. It's effort with love, effort with breath, effort that feels like prayer. Next is right mindfulness. Mindfulness, so often reduced to an app or a buzzword. But this is not some trendy relaxation technique. This is a way of being. It's the practice of being fully present with whatever arises, pain, joy, boredom, beauty, without clinging or pushing away. You become the witness, the still point in a turning world. And finally, we reach right concentration. This is the deep stillness that blooms when your heart and mind are aligned. It's not escape, it's arrival. Into the present, into yourself. Here you taste true peace. Not the kind sold on tropical retreats, but the kind that arises when the mind stops wandering and rests in truth. Together, these 8 steps don't just teach freedom, they embody it. They're not stairs to climb towards some future version of you. They're a circle, a rhythm, a return. And as you walk them one step at a time, you begin to understand you don't need more. You don't need to escape. You only need to wake up. And with that, the path is not just something you walk, it's something you become. In a world that constantly sells us fleeting pleasures, more things, more speed, more thrills, there's one word that barely makes it into the conversation: sukha. Not happiness as in a Friday night out or a weekend getaway. Not the sugar rush of compliments, likes, or applause. Sukha is something deeper, something more stable, something that doesn't vanish the moment the lights go out. But to understand sukha, we first need to unpack what we usually chase. Think about pleasure, that sudden spike of joy when you get a promotion, the thrill of new love, the satisfaction of a hot meal when you're starving. These things aren't bad. They're part of the human experience, but pleasure has a shadow, it fades. It always inevitably fades. And when it does, it leaves behind a whisper. Was that it? That's where sukha begins to emerge, not in the spike, but in the space. Not in the fireworks, but in the fire that gently keeps you warm. Sukha is the sense of contentment that doesn't depend on external events. It's the soft undercurrent of joy that remains, even when the world doesn't go your way. The Buddha knew the difference. He lived as a prince in the lap of sensory delight. He knew luxury, romance, entertainment, comfort, every worldly pleasure available. But in those opulent halls he felt a quiet unease, a deep knowing this is not lasting. So he left. And what he found wasn't a better kind of pleasure. It was freedom from needing pleasure to feel whole. In the teachings of Buddhism, sukha is not simply the opposite of dukkha, suffering, but a different quality altogether. Sukha is spacious, gentle, undemanding. It's the clarity that arises when the mind stops grasping. It's peace that doesn't depend on winning, impressing, achieving. It's presence without agenda. Let's make this real for a moment. Imagine 2 people walking through a forest. One is checking their phone constantly, trying to get a signal, already thinking about dinner, thinking about how many steps they've walked, whether this trail is better than the one they hiked last week. The other person, they're simply walking, breathing, smelling the trees, feeling the earth, noticing the rustle of the wind, the play of light through leaves. Who's happier? Pleasure might be momentary, a funny meme, a new gadget, a delicious bite. But sukha is more like an abiding ease. It's not exciting, but it's reliable. And ironically, the more you chase pleasure, the more it slips away. But the more you release the chase, the more sukha quietly arrives. This doesn't mean we must reject all forms of pleasure. The Buddha didn't teach against joy. He taught against attachment. You can still enjoy your coffee, your friends, your music. But when you stop demanding that these things complete you, you free them and yourself. And here's where the real shift happens. When you stop asking the world to make you happy, you start discovering happiness that was never dependent on the world. That's sukha. It lives in mindful moments, in open hearts, in the gentle silence between words, in knowing that you are already enough, in letting go of the storm and sinking into stillness. And this stillness, it isn't boring, it isn't numb. It's the most alive thing you'll ever touch. Because true happiness doesn't shout, it whispers. It doesn't need to be bought, proven, or broadcast. It simply is. And once you taste that kind of joy, the world no longer needs to keep entertaining you. Because your peace doesn't live out there. It lives right here in you. And now, as we begin to recognize this inner shift, another question arises. If chasing pleasure has distracted us for so long, and if sukha can only emerge through stillness and letting go, then how do we actually live this way in a noisy, demanding world? That's what we'll explore next. How a life of simplicity, awareness, and enoughness can transform not just our suffering, but our very sense of self. We live in a world where we're constantly told to run faster, aim higher, hustle harder. From the moment we wake up to the minute we fall asleep, we're conditioned to chase something. More money, more success, more recognition. And in that endless chase, many of us find ourselves locked in a rat race we never meant to enter. But what if the real race isn't out there? What if the true battlefield lies within? This isn't just poetic talk. It's a deep insight from Buddhist wisdom. The Buddha didn't teach us to run harder in the same direction as everyone else. He taught us to pause, to reflect, and to step off the spinning wheel entirely. Because what we often call ambition is sometimes just a socially acceptable disguise for fear. Fear of not being enough, of not having enough, of not being seen. And when fear drives our lives, we can climb to the top of any ladder and still feel like something's missing. That's the nature of the rat race. Even if you win it, you're still a rat. Now, here's the critical truth. Transformation doesn't begin with achieving something out there. It begins with a quiet revolution in here, in your heart, in your perception, and in your relationship with desire itself. And this revolution begins with a brave question. What am I really chasing? When you stop and look honestly, you might discover that beneath the quest for wealth, fame, or security, what you truly want is freedom. Not freedom to consume endlessly, but freedom from craving, from restlessness, from the gnawing emptiness that no amount of external success ever seems to fill. And that's why so many high achievers, despite all their trophies, feel quietly hollow. Because without inner peace, success becomes just another costume we wear, hoping others won't see how tired we truly are inside. Buddhism doesn't say ambition is evil. It simply asks, is your ambition liberating you or enslaving you? Are you pursuing goals that reflect your soul's calling, or just running harder on a treadmill built by someone else? To step off the rat race doesn't mean giving up. It means waking up. It means realizing that real power isn't in controlling the world, it's in mastering your mind. It's in choosing stillness over noise, presence over pressure, and depth over distraction. Because the truth is, what you seek is not out there. It's never been. The deepest peace, the most fulfilling joy, the most genuine contentment, all arise when you return to the simplicity of now, free from the demands of constant becoming. That is the revolution. And unlike the rat race, it's not loud. It doesn't need applause. It begins in silence, often unnoticed, but it transforms everything. You might still have a career, a dream, a to-do list, but now you're no longer chasing. You're choosing. You're no longer a prisoner of your thoughts. You're the observer, the master, the calm eye in the storm. This is not the kind of success the world brags about, but it's the kind of fulfillment that radiates quietly and never fades. Because when you stop running, you finally remember what it feels like to arrive. And in that arrival, there's peace. But how do you keep that peace alive? How do you nourish it when the world pulls you back into the noise? Let's explore that in the final chapter, a gentle return home where the greatest truth awaits. Shall we? What if the true purpose of life wasn't about achieving anything? Not the next big milestone, not a title, not even a legacy. What if, beneath all the striving, performing, and polishing, we were simply meant to be? To live awake, to love freely, and to let go completely. The Buddha didn't teach us how to win at life. He showed us how to be free from the very idea that we needed to. In a world that constantly whispers, be more, do more, get more. The Dharma quietly invites us to need less, want less, and be more present. Not someday, not after you've fixed yourself or finished the to-do list. Right now. Because the truth is, the moment we stop chasing happiness out there, we begin to discover the wellspring of peace that has always lived within. This is not a theory, it's a practice, and it begins not with effort but with awareness. So pause. Take a breath. Feel the simplicity of this very moment. You've arrived, not at the end of something, but perhaps at the beginning of seeing clearly. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real purpose of life, to wake up, to live with presence, to love without fear, to let go when it's time, and to walk the path with compassion for all beings, including yourself. If something in this touched your heart, if you felt seen or heard, or gently reminded of what truly matters, then maybe this path is calling to you too. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where each story is a step back home to yourself, where ancient teachings meet your modern journey, and where together we remember, you don't need to become someone else. You just need to remember who you are. Let this be your space of peace, your weekly reminder to slow down and look within. Until next time, may you be well, may you be free, may you be at peace.